Hey everybody, Eric Rennie here, and welcome to the 44th episode of the Writ Podcast. So the Ontario election is now just a little less than 2 weeks away. The leaders' debate are done, and it's the final sprint to Election Day. So joining me to discuss the election campaign today is David Coletto, CEO of Abacus Data, and Sabrina Nanji of Queen's Park Observer. Hello to both of you.
Hey, Eric.
Hey, Eric.
So I think we should probably start with the news that came out really recently. Sabrina, we heard from both Andrea Horwath and Mike Schreiner testing positive for COVID-19. At least at the time they're recording this, Steven Del Duca and Doug Ford were not. But yeah, what's happening with that?
Yeah, not so great for the NDP and the Greens. You know, we're exactly 2 weeks out from Election Day, and they've essentially been benched. So they'll be campaigning virtually. And probably pumping up a lot of their candidates instead. I mean, we're now getting itinerary for Diane Sachs from the Greens, one of their star candidates in University Rosedale, of course, represented by the NDP currently, historically a Liberal bastion. So no doubt this is gonna hurt them a little bit, I think, before they can get out on the hustings again. Steven Del Duca tested negative this morning. He's feeling fine. And Doug Ford, it was a little bit unclear if he tested or not, but I got confirmation and he did not take a test, but he says that, per the guidelines, he's no longer a close contact of Schreiner or Horwath. They were all at the debate on Monday night in close quarters. It was a rather small studio. They shook hands. They were kind of yelling at each other at some moments. I'm sure we'll dig into all of that. But Doug Ford says he's feeling fine and he'll still be out, pressing the flesh and kissing babies. So look out.
with the yes, speaking moistly, if we remember. Anyway, but yeah, if you think about Aaron O'Toole in the last federal election campaigning virtually didn't seem to help him that much. David, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, what kind of impact it could have.
I just think, with 2 weeks to go, anything that takes, momentum away, especially maybe for Schreiner, although we'll talk about, what the polls are saying about his debate performance. I think many people, at least watching it, thought he did pretty good. Not great that he has to be off the trail for a few days, and same with Ms. Horwath. So I just think it's just bad timing, and I don't know how long they can go without actually being around people now, because I think some of the rules are you've got to sort of isolate until you test negative. So I don't think these are their star assets, and when you have to take them off the field, it's got to hurt a little bit at least.
Yeah, and obviously we hope all the best for them, that they'll recover quickly and be able to get back out there. So, but David, you mentioned it. Now you have some polling data. It's still in the field, but you have some results that you can share with us, some post-debate polling, because we've been waiting for it. There's been a couple of polls that came out this week, but all of them either were almost entirely or mostly done before the debate. So what are these post-debate numbers that you have fresh out of the field?
So exclusive for the Writ audience here, we were in the field Wednesday and Thursday. We're going to continue. We've got 891 interviews done. We weighted it so it's representative of the population, and the indications are the debate doesn't seem to have had any impact as of yet. On the horse race, we've got the Tories ahead by 11. Actually increased their lead over the Ontario Liberals 37 to 26, with the NDP at 25, all within the margin of error movement, but that gap has opened up with the Greens at 5%. How people feel about the leaders, not much movement. Doug Ford about even, Andrea Horwath about even. Still more people view Mr. Del Duca negatively than positively. On debate specific questions though, we asked three questions. About 37% of people said they watched the debate or watched at least some of it.
How does that compare to past campaigns?
Probably a little. It's not that high because we know that the ratings probably were not that high. But this is what people perceive, and 28% though said they heard nothing about these debates at all. So that shows you that they barely broke through for more than half, for more than a quarter. But when we asked people who either watched or heard about the debates through the news or through friends or colleagues, and we asked, who do you think did the most to win your vote? Doug Ford came well ahead at 36. For him, Del Duca at 19 and Horwath at 17, Mike Schreiner at 10. And then we ask, who did the most to lose your vote? And Doug Ford wins that one as well at 32 for Mr. Ford, 20 for Del Duca, 19 for Horwath, and 6 for Mike Schreiner. So pundits like me said Mike Schreiner had a great night. He did really well. It shows the power of a filter and partisanship in terms of how we consume these debates. But looking at these results and how they have played out in past elections when we've asked the exact same questions, my sense is no one really won the debate, but perhaps because nobody won the debate, Doug Ford won the debate because his numbers held and there doesn't seem to be any movement away from the state of the race that we were seeing before the debate.
Yeah, I remember in the federal campaigns when you asked these kinds of questions, Yves-François Blanchet, and he would score very well, and then there'd be a bump in the polls for the Bloc, or Jagmeet Singh in 2019, and there was a bump. But when you have this sort of even, where you have nearly as many people who say you won the vote or did the most to win the vote as did the most to lose the vote, it doesn't suggest we should expect some big surge or movement in the polls in the coming days.
Yeah, it basically means that if you went into this debate leaning towards Mr. Ford, you thought Mr. Ford won the debate. If you were leaning towards another candidate, you thought he lost, and vice versa. And what probably happened, because there was some back and forth between Mr. Del Duca and Ms. Horwath, some liberals were saying, well, she lost, and some New Democrats were saying he lost. But at the end of the day, it really moved nobody away from where they started when the debate began.
Sabrina, how does that line up with maybe the perceptions you've heard from partisans, people who are involved with the party, who kind of did their own kind of grading on how well their leaders did? How does that line up?
Yeah, well, I think part of me is a little depressed about the viewership there, because of course, this is our bread and butter for us political nerds. But I think every camp, every leader kind of did what they were supposed to do, and every camp is feeling pretty good. Doug Ford, for the most part, kept his cool. He stayed on message. I think, the Tory war room was pretty happy about that. Del Duca didn't get angry, but he was a bit defensive, kind of positioning himself almost as official opposition, which we know, with the NDP and the Liberals kind of jockeying for second place. They're feeling pretty good about that. One Liberal insider told me that if the only thing people remember about Steven Del Duca, who is still relatively unknown to the public, is that he has 2 daughters and they go to public school, then they're just fine by that. He's obviously trying to paint himself as the fresh face of the Liberals and get away from some of the unpopular decision-making, some of that political baggage from the former Wynne government. I thought Andrea Horwath, everyone was kind of making a big to-do about Doug Ford's binder and bringing his notes, which the debate consortium, was against that. And Ford's team insisted on that he had his little cheat sheet there. But I don't think the general public cared too much about that. And it almost seemed like Andrea Horwath could have used a binder. She was a bit shaky in the beginning, no major breakthrough moments for her. But again, I think maybe the bar was a bit higher for Horwath, because this is her 4th time on the debate stage. There's really a high bar for her, higher expectations, not a lot of room, to mess up there. And I think, for the most part, what we were saying, in the media, observers, is that Schreiner kind of came out on top. This is the first time a lot of people would have seen him, gotten to know him, as a Green person on the debate stage. So that's a big feat in itself. But he was probably the only one that actually was able to get under Ford's skin. I think Ford was even visibly turning red at one moment. And he had these powerful times where I thought one of them was when he asked, have you actually spoken to a nurse lately? When Doug Ford was kind of, talking about his healthcare promises, which, there was a big protest of nurses outside too. So I think, I'm a little bit surprised actually that Schreiner didn't get a bit of a bump, but what I've been hearing anecdotally from people is that, I really want to vote Green, but I feel like it's a wasted vote. I think we've talked about, Eric, the per vote subsidy can, if you get 2% of the vote in Ontario, you get a per vote tax subsidy, so you get some more money. And that goes a long way for political parties to, push for issues, have more resources. So I don't think there's ever a wasted vote, but at the end of the day, there were a lot of fiery exchanges, but we kind of got a lot of talking points too. So I guess we'll see, how much it can move the needle once all the polling starts rolling in.
Yeah, well, I mean, from David's numbers, I guess it suggests we shouldn't expect too much. It is Schreiner at least was above water on those numbers, so was Ford. So maybe it suggests that they did the most to help themselves. And I suppose you could imagine that Ford did the most to shore up his own supporters. Schreiner did the most to maybe expose himself to some people who wouldn't have thought of voting Green. And what you mentioned about having a chance to win, I find is interesting, because I'm sure there's lots of people who might have seen Mike Schreiner and said, oh, he seems nice enough, or I like, his passion on this or that issue, but he's got no chance in my riding. But maybe in some of those parts of the province, he can now make the case in a handful of ridings that, maybe here, this is the Green candidate that has the best shot. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But David, Ford, during this campaign, he's been pretty low key. He had the binder. I don't think, debates are a pop quiz. I don't think people are expecting that you have to know everything off the top of your head. But, he's been running a very, it seems, controlled, low key, low drama kind of campaign. And it seems to be helping. And is he tapping into a lack of engagement and just, in a way, almost trying to ensure that people don't start paying attention to this campaign, because then he can just cruise?
I think to some extent, if you're paying attention, it's because you think there's something at stake, and the stakes are higher. And my read of this data right now is, there's some people who really don't like Mr. Ford. That has been their view since the moment he was elected. And nothing that he's going to do is going to convince them otherwise. But what he's done effectively is, not to take this metaphor too far given the pandemic, but inoculate himself from what is typical progressive conservative liabilities in the province, which is cuts to public services, which is social conservative issues, sometimes gets them into trouble. And if you look at the failure of conservative leaders in the last 20 years, from John Tory to Tim Hudak, it's because they've fallen into that trap. Doug Ford won, not by default in 2018, but largely by default because Kathleen Wynne was so unpopular. This time, he's going to win, likely because, in my view, if he does win, because he's actually where more voters at least want their government to be, and there's no clear alternative to that, right? And so if anything, this debate, although the goal, I think, for either Ms. Horwath or Mr. Del Duca was to try to consolidate those anti-Ford voters around one of them, they actually fought each other more sometimes than they did Mr. Ford, and that left people, I think, more divided between them. And that's given Mr. Ford the advantage. So I think his low key, don't make waves, speak in generalities, be boring in a way, which is very un-Doug Ford-like, is helping him. And it's really helping him among older voters who, is, when we talk about an 11-point lead province-wide, it masks the fact that he's almost at a 20-point lead among those over the age of 45, 43, 26. And that is the silver bullet to win an election when, at least for now, turnout might be lower, interest is lower, and those are more reliable voters. So it means he's even more likely to win a majority if he can hold those kind of numbers among older voters.
Sabrina, you've scrummed Doug Ford. You've gone to, you've called in, I guess, now over the last couple of years because no one was there in person, but to those press events. Does it make sense as a strategy for him to reduce the amount of time that he's kind of talking, answering questions? Do you find that this is smart for him, or because like Doug Ford, as David said, trying to be boring? I don't know. Does that work?
Well, it worked for Bill Davis, right? He said bland works, and it did for the former Tory premier. And I think, that's certainly clearly what the strategy is for the Conservatives this time around. And it does seem to be working for them. We've had some cute Fordisms throughout the pandemic when he was up there every day, almost, at the height of COVID. The cheese slipped off the cracker, calling people yahoos. He has, put his foot in his mouth. He did. Del Duca was kind of forced to fact check him on the fly when he was saying things like the Liberals want to, vote against the gas tax cut, which they don't. And so he has put his foot in his mouth before, but just people that I've been talking to, they're kind of very forgiving. They think, he's just one of us. He makes mistakes. So I think, in a way, being unscripted does work to in Ford's favor. It's an endearing quality sometimes. I think the joke he made about the Canadian bobsled team seemed a bit canned. I don't know if that one was in the binder, but it certainly seems to be working. And the Liberals and the Conservatives are the only ones who are not inviting media. We get their advisories and where they are, and sometimes they'll let us ask questions, but they're not on the buses with the NDP. But I don't know if that's actually helped the NDP very much. The ability to have a journalist there every day, on the campaign trail, making the stops with the leader, because I guess, the thought was that might result in more media coverage, obviously. And I don't know if they've been able to grab as much headlines through that, or if that's made a big difference with them. So, for Ford, though, it kind of means that they're getting more local coverage on the stops that they're at. It's not necessarily the Queen's Park Press Gallery following you everywhere. Of course, that we are doing that as much as we can, but certainly I think that is a strategy. And yeah, to David's point, to kind of have the Horwath and Del Duca battling it out with each other, and Ford kind of trying to stay above the fray. I mean, Del Duca said it himself that anytime Horwath attacks him, Doug Ford smiles, and I'm sure that entire war room is grinning about some of that happening.
And Eric, if I could just add, I think one of the things the opposition, or the Liberals and New Democrats, the Greens to some extent, are having a hard time doing is how to actually make something stick to Mr. Ford, right? In the same survey, and we've been asking this on every survey, we asked people which of the three leaders, we use only the three, have certain characteristics. Doug Ford wins on every single one we ask, from closest to my values to most willing to make admit when he makes a mistake, to toughest and strongest leader. And that's a signal to me that he has a brand that is quite strong, that has been able to withstand all of the criticism. And it feels like to me sometimes that you watch, particularly Ms. Horwath during the debate, I think it was pretty obvious that she got so frustrated because in her mind, and I think in a lot of progressive voters, particularly activists, they can't fathom how Doug Ford is still the Premier of Ontario. They can't fathom that he ever got elected in the first place. And so they don't know how to compete with that, right? And so I think that's a big part of the problem. If I told, it must drive people crazy when I tell them that, who has the best vision for the province. Doug Ford beats Andrea Horwath by 16 points, right? 45-29 with Del Duca in 25th. When I ask even more, who's the most competent leader? Doug Ford wins by 21 points over Andrea Horwath, right? And so they can't even imagine how that's true. And it's hard to then compete against it if that's the case.
I think we also see the same kind of thing with federal Conservatives and Justin Trudeau. So it does go both ways, right? Because exactly. That to me has seemed to have been one of the blind spots for the federal Conservatives, is that they can't understand why someone would like Justin Trudeau in the same way that a lot of New Democrats and Liberals wouldn't understand how you could like Doug Ford. And if you can't get you can't get around that blind spot, then you can't reach the people who don't think Doug Ford is that bad of a guy, but maybe you could be convinced not to vote for him. Because if you set your hair on fire to say that he's the worst premier there's ever been, you're going to make people be like, whoa, wait a minute, he might have some problems. He's not that bad. You already almost make sure that people go on the defensive. And I think you see the same thing with Justin Trudeau. Let's move on to Steven Del Duca, because you were just talking about, David, those personal numbers. Has he done anything in this campaign to improve them?
Well, I think there's a difference between has he moved them and has he done anything to move them. I think again, my opinion, I thought he had a pretty good debate. I thought he came off as calm and reasonable, but those numbers haven't moved. There are still more people who view him negatively. A lot of people don't really know who he is. I'm just quickly going to look at Best Premier. He's still in third when it comes to Best Premier, by 3 points behind Andrea Horwath. So he hasn't moved any of the key metrics. The only thing he's got going for him is that he's the Liberal leader in a province that typically votes Liberal. And I think it's a measure of just how little engaged most voters are, or prospective voters are, that he hasn't been able to make an impact. I mean, we talked about this, Eric, on the last podcast we did just after the debate. People were more likely to be searching for him that night, in large part because they didn't ever think about him before, and they saw him on that stage for the first time. But I don't think, at least the early evidence is, it's made much difference in how they're going to vote for. If anything, if there's any evidence from the surveys that the Liberals are moving in the wrong direction, their vote share might be shrinking, not growing, as some of the other polls done just before the debate suggested might have been happening.
He's also the only leader out of the four that I'd say is in danger of not winning his own seat. And Sabrina, you went to Vaughan Woodbridge and talked to people, and I think you got a lot of shrugs.
Yeah. So like, obviously the big caveat that I'm going to preface this with is that I was just door knocking around. It's called the Piazza del Sol Plaza. There's like a gelato shop, La Paloma. So I kind of was just hanging around there in Woodbridge. It's not, as in-depth as the kind of polling that David does, of course, but it was a really tough time. Like, I was around for 2 hours, hanging around anyone that would talk to me, and I couldn't find an outright Del Duca supporter. I've since, heard after I published a story and spoken with some who, think he's great, have been supporting him along the way, but I didn't see any Del Duca signs. There were a lot for Tibolo, and generally, people in that riding obviously know Del Duca because he represented them before 2018, and they gave him the boot in 2018, and now it's represented by Conservative Minister Michael Tibolo. I think 338 Canada had the polling that's a coin toss, that riding there. Some of the internal Conservative polling suggests that Del Duca won't win that seat back. But what I was hearing from voters is that, the things that they don't like are his move to make COVID vaccines mandatory for students in schools. And I think that was bold, if I can put it that way, a bold promise. But it was kind of a visceral thing. Like, one father of four, he has 4 kids between 10 and 18, and he said, you know what, like, I voted Liberal in the past, I was really considering it, and then they proposed these mandatory COVID vaccines for students in schools. Of course, there are the same exemptions that regularly apply, but that just threw me away. He told me he wasn't a fan of that. And there are people, of course, there who are willing to give him another shot. But I think that it was a pointed move for Del Duca in the debate when they were asked, do you have any regrets? And he sort of admitted, the past Liberal government, and himself included in Vaughan Woodbridge, they didn't listen to voters, and that was a lesson learned. So I think, that could end up working out in his favor. And I'll just tease a little baby scoop that I have coming out in Queen's Park Observer. I went to go take a look at the Facebook ads that all the parties are running, and the only ones that are targeted from the Ontario Liberal Party are in Vaughan Woodbridge. And so some people are telling me, that's a clear sign they're worried. Other people are telling me, well, of course, the party is going to be targeting the leader's riding. But it seems like that could cause a lot of problems for Del Duca if he doesn't win his seat. I think I may have mentioned before on the pod that just the Liberal Party's own rules say that if you don't win the premier's seat, you get a leadership review. If Del Duca formed official opposition, I think, of course, the Liberals would give him another shot. That would be an impressive move for him. But if he doesn't win his own seat, I think that could mean, especially his leadership would be in trouble too.
Yeah, I have lots of family in Vaughan Woodbridge, and having spent a lot of my time and youth in that riding, I would say he's going to have a hard time. I think it's the kind of riding that really, I think, like Doug Ford appeals to them. And I think even though Stephen Lecce represents the riding to the northeast-ish, he also plays big in that riding in terms of, the 2 Italian Canadian candidates, Michael Tibolo, and I think, so I'd be surprised if unless Steven Del Duca wins the election, becomes premier, I think he's going to have a hard time. That means there has to be a pretty big Liberal wave to unseat the Tories in that seat.
Just from my own projections, I often have the Liberals in the NDP more or less a seat or 2 apart in terms of the official opposition role. It would be quite ironic if the Liberals fell 1 seat short, and that seat was Del Duca's that he didn't win. Right. So let's talk about one of the other leaders. We did mention him, Mike Schreiner. I'm just kind of interested in what chances they now have for that second seat. There has been some polling, and I know, David, it hasn't really showed up in yours, but there has been a couple polls. in Northern Ontario. That includes Parry Sound Muskoka, which is very far south, but it is included in Northern Ontario. And it's a riding where the Greens finished second. They have a history there where they usually get somewhere around 20% of the vote. There's no Liberal candidate because they had to dump their Liberal candidate, and that could boost the Greens, who are being seen as really the one who can fight with the PCs to win the seat. But Sabrina, how serious do you think it is for the Greens to win a second seat? I know they talk a lot about Dianne Sachs, but University of Rosedale, I'm sorry, not going to vote Green. And if I'm wrong, people can come at me afterwards, but I don't think it's going to vote Green. But Parry Sound Muskoka, he's someone, the candidate there that Mike Schreiner spends time talking about. So they clearly think that they have a shot.
Yeah, and that's kind of been the Green strategy, right? Like pooling their resources in one spot or a couple of spots where they think they can win. That's, what helped Mike Schreiner get elected in Guelph the last time around. And we have seen him, hitting the campaign trail hard over in Parry Sound Muskoka. And as you just said, there's no Liberal competition there. I think one of the numbers I had seen floating out there was that they were polling at 20%, which, okay, is that enough to get you the seat? We'll see. But, Schreiner's made the point that used to be his numbers before too, around 20%. And look, he won that seat. So, certainly they are making a hard push for Parry Sound Muskoka. There's no Conservative incumbent. And so it's certainly more in play for them. I think, Schreiner, we always say he punches above his weight. And one of the most effective things he's done, I think, in this campaign is push the other parties. I think even today with the NDP promising to get rid of tolls on the 407 for truck drivers, the Greens are calling them copycats on that, essentially, because that was a Green promise. The Greens were the first ones to promise to double ODSP. That's something the NDP is also promising to do now. We already had a costed platform from them. So it does seem like they're kind of making these last minute changes on the fly, maybe just to be more in contention with the Greens. So I think that the chance is definitely there, but province wide, the polling we've seen, like they haven't really budged very much. It's around 4 or 5%. And of course, Schreiner has been in Guelph every day. This COVID, him getting COVID, like I guess we'll see, if how much that really hurts him. But I think, having him on the debate stage probably introduced him at least to a lot more people, and maybe they're thinking about it more seriously now. But certainly if you talk to a Green, they think they've got this in the bag.
I mean, I think just Eric, looking at the history of that riding, the worst the Conservatives done in the last, 5 elections, I think is around 41%. And that was in 2014. There is no incumbent and there's no Liberal candidate. I think there is a chance the Greens could pull it off, but they need to basically, consolidate every Liberal to come to them and then get some new Democrat votes there. They did well. They got 20% of the vote last time. That's their base. They can do it. But I still think it's a harder riding maybe than one like Guelph, where the splits are maybe more even, and there's not a tendency to be a solid Conservative riding. I think Parry Sound Muskoka, I think Frank Miller, and that was the former premier, and then his son Norm Miller took over. There's a legacy of being progressive Conservative for, I don't even know if it's gone anything but progressive Conservative. So it would be a shock, but it's not impossible.
Also, the old riding of Tony Clement, if we remember, that he was there when he was a federal MP. I think it is going to be tough. But you know what? Mike Schreiner ended up winning Guelph by a really big margin. I think going into that election, there was expectation that he would win Guelph by maybe a bit, and he ended up winning it, I think, by 20 points or something like that. He took over 40% of the vote. So maybe there'll be a big wave, but yeah, it'll be the thing to watch. So we'll start wrapping up a little bit. We'll wrap up first though with Andrea Horwath. David, do you see any scenario out of this election where she is in a place to run a 5th time as leader of the NDP?
I'm not in any world understanding why she would want to. That's up to her. Maybe not actually up to her too. I can't see it. Look, I look at this and say, you've been leader of this party now for almost or just over 14 years. You still are kind of hitting this wall where you're not breaking through. And I think you have to, if I was Andrea Horwath, which I'm not, but if I was looking at my ability to kind of convince people. I've had 4 kicks at the can. I almost won in 2018. This was my chance, and I just couldn't do it. So I think it will probably be time for a change. I think there comes a point, even though New Democrats, the saying goes, are typically more generous to their leaders than, say, other parties. I think it will be time for a generational change for the party, and especially if they're not official opposition after this. If they are official opposition, maybe there's a chance but I still can't imagine she wants to do this a 5th time. And that will be probably the biggest driver in this.
I think both Howard Hampton and Bob Rae ran the NDP in 4 election campaigns as well. So the party does have a history of keeping a leader for a while. But, maybe 5 is a lot. Sabrina, I know you've written about some New Democrats who were already thinking about the post-Andrea Horwath era. What would it take for that not to happen?
Well, I think probably like winning the premier seat. The 901 Club folks, the guys that want to, start pressuring her to step aside at 901 the minute polls close. They're saying that she kind of already had her shot too in 2018. Like, why couldn't they hold Doug Ford to at least a smaller majority? There, of course, change election. Everyone was, kind of tired of the Liberals after 15 years. We know that. So there's obviously, of course, a lot of factors at play, but I think it's still rare that, any leader would get 5 attempts at this. And of course, if they lose ground to the Liberals, I think that's going to incense a lot more New Democrats as well. And like I said, there's a high bar for her. And the dippers that I'm talking to, they really believe in their party and their policies and what they're putting out on the table. And they're kind of laying this at Andrea Horwath's feet, like their ability, like they're not able to really move the polls, much like we're seeing now. And they're saying, we just can't win with her at the helm. So the New Democrats I'm talking to aren't happy. I think, they're saying we're basically waiting out Horwath. And so, there's only 2 weeks left before they can turn this around. As David pointed out, she tends to poll better than her own party with, I guess, in second place for people seeing her as best premier. And so her being sidelined now because of COVID, not being out there, talking to people where she's a little more natural than we saw her during the debate. Like she was doing this weird thing where she would smile after everything she said. Like she would be talking about something very serious, like deaths and long-term care, and then smile after. Like I think she's a lot more personable when she's one-on-one, with a person in real life. And so certainly this is gonna, I think, hurt her as well. And it's such a Horwath-focused campaign for the NDP too. But yeah, I think that if she doesn't get the premier seat, her days will be very numbered.
David, I'll have just a closing thought from you. You've done polling in lots of campaigns. There's 2 weeks to go. Things can happen in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. Do you see anything that suggests something could happen? Or do you, when you look at your numbers, do you feel like it's going to just kind of cruise through election day?
Well, only because if I say it, it will become the opposite. But no, I look at these numbers and the debate, if there was going to be a chance, because I did think some of the leaders hit Doug Ford with effective arguments. The question is, can they execute them and scale them really, right? Scale them and get people to think about it. Look, there's one question we asked on the last survey that we've asked again, and the numbers haven't changed. And that is, if Doug Ford gets reelected, do you think a number of things are going to get better or worse? Things like public education, healthcare, your cost of living. Not enough people are saying it's going to get worse if he's reelected. And so that tells me the desire for change isn't there. Ontarians typically reelect a government after its first term, and everything's pointing to that. And Doug Ford's numbers are still the most popular leader in the province. And so unless any of that changes, which I think in 2 weeks is hard to do when nobody's paying that much attention. I shouldn't say nobody's paying attention. Not enough people are nearly paying enough attention. I'm still on my best estimate is Doug Ford's headed to another majority.
Well, we know that 100% of listeners to this podcast are very engaged with the election,
They are.
Sticking around for 40 minutes or so of discussion about an election campaign that hasn't exactly gathered a lot of, enthusiasm and attention from anybody, but, we're still engaged in it. And, 2 weeks, lots can happen, and we'll chat again, I'm sure. And thanks to both of you for coming on. And thanks also to David for doing double duty this week. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks again to David Coletto, CEO of Abacus Data, and Sabrina Nanji of Queen's Park Observer. And you can find her newsletter at qpobserver.com. So if you like this discussion and if you like this video, I hope that you'll subscribe to this YouTube channel. I actually have a few Ontario-related items on the channel right now. I have a bit of an election 101. If you're not from Ontario, or if you're not that familiar with Ontario politics, it kind of lays the groundwork, gives you all the information that you need to know in this election campaign. I also have a history of Ontario elections going back all the way to 1867 to 2018. It's a fun video, and hope that you'll check it out. So until next week, thanks for watching.